Stephen, thank you, Simon, brilliant as ever. My experiences growing up are kind of through a very similar era to Simon. That sense, it didn't seem like it could be any other way, that everything was just going to move forward from one thing to another. The next thing came, everything was new. In the backdrop of my life, I'm thinking of things like the Concorde and Jodrell Bank in Cheshire, which was very near where I was, where made me think that Jodrell Bank was built in the late 50s by a pioneering scientist in Manchester, Bernard Lavelle. He thought by now there would just be millions of Jodrell Banks floating around in space, but it made me think in the 60s that when man walked on the moon, they'd actually begun their walk in the scented hedgerows of Cheshire, because it just felt like that's where the moon had actually begun. So you had a completely different sort of sense of movement into a future. There's something Eric Smith said lately, just thinking about Simon talking about popular music itself, where he said, television is over, it just doesn't know it yet. I think the same is true to an extent of pop music. Pop music is over, it doesn't yet know it though. And it's not necessarily in television sense. There'll be no more television programs, there'll be no more sort of things on the television that we're excited about. And then the same with pop music, there'll still be songs and there'll still be performers and a kind of glamour. But the structures and everything that held it in place and gave it the greater context and gave it the meaning is definitely gone. And to some extent, I kind of find myself thinking sometimes that there's a weird sickness that someone like me has, the worry and the anxiety. Obviously, growing up in the 60s and 70s and then into the 80s and 90s, the worst thing possible was a kind of nostalgia, sentimentality for the past. And then sometimes when you're in discussions like this, you find yourself being sentimental about the past and nostalgic for the past, and you have to sort of preface it almost with it's not to say that it was better then, that I'm yearning to be back then at all. That would be horrendous. The spirit still holds true, but what it is, I guess, is that it was just different. So obviously the sensibility now that I have, finding myself in 2013 discussing these things, I sometimes feel a little bit like it must have been like for people who had funny enough, those people that had that thing that we were actually racing away from, which is when they're talking about the war. Everybody's really worried that they've got to get it out about what the war was like before they all die off. And there's a sense I sometimes feel that we better keep talking about this, just to say not that it was better or that it was particularly special, but that it was very, very different. And sometimes it's be careful what you wish for, be careful what you wish for in all senses. I've always been wishing for a generational shift, because I find it most peculiar that, which is again something we didn't have in our day, is that in the 60s and 70s it was pretty much you got to about 23 or 24 you might have lost an interest in pop music. And even in 1983-84 I stopped writing for the New Musical Express because I was 24, 25 and I considered I was too old. Much to my surprise, everybody just kept moving on and kept writing about it. But that was the kind of thing that was just you didn't really think that there would be an interest in this kind of thing, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s. So that there became this strange sort of layering, this multiple layering of people all interested in the same thing, which completely contradicted the original spirit of the damn thing, which was that you were organising a space and a location that was anti your parents, anti your grandparents, anti even these days your great-grandparents. So it's I think it's again caused a sort of chaos of people all rummaging around in the same area. And to that extent, I sometimes think that maybe, we've handed on something that's a little distracting to a smaller and smaller area of people in a way, and it's the idea that what we're looking for in terms of transforming an idea and transforming an idea about who you are and where you are in the world. A lot of people are still looking within pop music where it's not going to be anymore. Sometimes I think that the great Elvis Presley moment or the great Beatles moment, the great Sex Pistols moment, it might actually be, a riot in Turkey or, a commotion in Brazil, that's actually the equivalent response. It's just so far removed from what we think is going to be a kind of a protest or a cultural form of disobedience. It's so far removed from what we now think that is, because to some extent it's been coded that it will still be skinny trousers and it will still be a certain way that four young men pose. For me, it's just gone somewhere completely different. Hence why pop music is over, it just doesn't yet know it. And there's still that narrowing down. Simon talks about the way the NME write about music has an apologetic quality. Well, it can't have anything else in a sense, because a lot of the sounds that those kind of bands now make, when those sounds were originally made in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there was a sense of ideological sting in them. You know, when the Gang of Four made that particular noise, it wasn't just because it was an attractive noise, it was because, you know, it was an assault on received wisdom, on received cliches. It was an attack on previous music. There was an ideological quality. And I think a lot of that has gone missing. One of the things I've recently done, which, you know, seduces one into nostalgia and sentimentality, is I contributed to the curation and organisation of the David Bowie exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And that obviously is an interesting moment, the moment that when pop music goes into the museums and the galleries. And I went in, you know, very, very specifically because I was anxious that it would end up looking like the Hard Rock Cafe or, you know, the Great British Rock and Roll Museum, you know, just a load of guitars on the wall and bits of memorabilia. Whereas for me, it was a moment that I felt was important, without being too sentimental, in terms of the moment that pop music does make this movement into a different world, if you like. The better end of it. It has a different kind of almost a critical approach to it. The idea of, instead of rock critics who are kind of dead now because there's billions of us buggers, the idea that it would be a museum, a gallery, in a traditional sense that would make the decision on why or why not this was important in a different sort of way. But what was fascinating working with David Bowie's archive, and there was something fascinating about constantly planning for the future. From the moment he was about 13 or 14, he was already deciding that he would be a star, and he was collecting everything. So he collected everything as he went along. So it's all available now. And it's wonderful. I mean, we only scratched the surface of the V&A in some marvellous building in New York. There's a David Bowie archive that's like something like Citizen Kane, or, you know, sort of the Indiana Jones movie. It just goes on forever. All his stuff collected, you know, and then distributed now in a small way. And what I noticed about certainly David Bowie, and I think it was true in a lot of musicians in the 60s and 70s, that their interests were in other things, much bigger things. They weren't just interested in recycling music, they were interested in literature and drama and theatre and avant-garde ideas and politics. And then what tended to happen, and I think that moment Simon refers to, when it reached the Oasis and to extend the Blurs and those kind of things, is that music really had lost all that other stuff. It was only inspired by other music. And the other music that it was inspired by, that had been inspired by this other stuff, somehow all that was knocked off. So it was just recycling music itself and not this other stuff. And that was for me a big moment when things changed. That you look at through the David Bowie archive, and the majority of things you see that he was interested in weren't necessarily musical. He was very good at sort of being a Mike Yarwood and impersonating those things around him. But the other thing that he was interested in was creating this kind of wider context, this wider story of who he was, if you like, you know. And the other thing you notice also is the arrival of technology, certainly with Bowie. You know, Simon mentioned the Art of Noise, and I have to say that I was a member of the Art of Noise in 1982-83. And there was a classic example of when technology arrived, it changed everything. And I think that was a thing that changed pop music a lot as it went along. It was just this constant arrival of this fantastic technology that immediately enabled you to make extraordinary new sounds. With the Art of Noise, you know, we instantly branded ourselves as futurists. You know, we nicked the name from the Italian futurists in the early part of the 20th century. We regenerated the idea of a futuristic spirit in a commercial pop setting. And even me just saying that gives you an idea of the sort of idealism we had, the sense of possibility that we had, that you could do that kind of thing. You know, I was inheriting the ideas from people like David Bowie and the Sex Pistols, if you like. That pop music gave you this opportunity to transmit, you know, tricky avant-garde ideas in a commercial setting, and even to have that kind of sensibility, you know, was interesting and maybe, and I hesitate to go to the next stage of this sentence because that's where the sentimentality and nostalgia kicks in. But it's that sense that that's what, you know, certainly pop music has lost, that sort of sense of ideological sting, the sense of a greater meaning, the sense of developing context. It can't develop context anymore in the way that it could in the 60s and 70s. And again, I'm not saying it's because it was better. It was just different. The spaces and the surfaces and the photography and the record sleeves and the way that you could move in a paradoxical way actually quicker enabled you to create this deeper, richer context, whereas now you can't tell those stories. Your stories are crowded out. Everything disappears. So it's kind of thinking that maybe that idea of thinking about the future, it was a sense of taking risks, taking kind of creative risks that the culture that enabled you to take, because at the time it was also craving progress. It was craving progress because of the war. It was craving progress because the 20th century had literally been a century that was all about movement forward. Everything was changing, everything could change. And even when it hit catastrophic cul-de-sacs, there was always recovery. And those great moments of electronic music that Simon refers to, like the Marauders, like the Kraftwerks, like that whole kind of German scene, that was in a sense of repairing history. There was a grander vision to it. It wasn't just about making decorative music that might get played on the John Peel show. There was a real sense of a mission, a vision, a greater mission and vision in a way that than culture sort of represented it at the time. You know, even like Simon says, up to the early 90s, there was very little serious reference to these things in the media, in the sense of them being anything other than pop music. But they were on missions. They had visions. I've always taken that very seriously. I mean, one of the things I did for Stephen's Tomorrow Never Knows a package, if I may call it that, package tour, was write a manifesto. I thought it was interesting that the idea of a manifesto had become a dated thing. The idea that you set out with some sort of aims and ambitions that you would do this. I'm thinking about Simon talking about dates. I remember in 1982 it became very apparent that we were heading towards 1984. And back then the idea of 1984 was such an extraordinary year because of George Orwell. You know, George Orwell had made it, like Simon says, a target, something to hit. And I deemed it absolutely imperative that it was something to celebrate. And I did kind of write a manifesto about inventing a kind of pop group, that was interested in all sorts of mischievous, underground, peculiar, forbidden ideas, and that this pop group would be unbelievably successful and it would completely conquer the planet. It was like an article I'd write for the NME, but I was writing it about an imaginary band. And there would be these amazing T-shirts and they would transmit messages and slogans of an extraordinarily subversive nature. And I wanted 1984 to have, you know, that kind of pop group in it. Peculiarly, it actually happened in reality. You know, somehow the willpower, the ambition to you know, create this manifesto resulted in a group called Frankie Goes to Hollywood. And the willpower, the manifesto, came true. And it was a time, I guess, when manifestos sometimes could come true. You know, sometimes you planned things to such an extent you willed it into being. I'm not saying that I actually knew what I was doing or I had any idea that it would happen. And to be honest, most of the time I never thought it would happen. But when it did, you know, obviously I claimed that I knew exactly what I was doing all along. And so, for me, I find my interest now in terms of what's happened to the future sometimes does come down to the wider sense of commissioning as well, the wider sense of what's allowed, the wider sense of a form of censorship, if you like. Because I don't want to be so sentimental and nostalgic that I don't think people are up to interesting things, people are up to provocative things. Because that would be just ridiculous. And to some extent, everybody has the same ideas about who they are and where they are, and they're trying to represent them. But there's been a narrowing down of the dare, the risks. You know, we used to complain about it when there were the gatekeepers in the record industry and things like that. But oddly enough, there was a kind of risk-taking going on. It was a risk-taking with meaning. Because as much as we used to hate these guys, A&R men, we used to hate people who chose what records were played on the radio. We used to hate those that made decisions about what was on the television. In a funny sort of way, they were still embedded in an idea that wasn't totally commercial, that wasn't totally anxious about ratings. And so they would take risks. And I think there's been less and less of that encouragement of those people that might have the ideas that will give us an equivalent of Marshall McLuhan's early warning system, but for now, because they don't resemble the ideas that we now think are radical or risk-taking or make kind of unusual, disobedient manoeuvres. Because the patterns and the templates have been set. Everybody assumes now, they know what a radical decision is or a bit of risk-taking is. Funnily enough, I was talking last night about the Game of Thrones with Ed. And the funny thing about the Game of Thrones, I always remember when George R.R. Martin wrote it, and one of the reasons he wrote it, and he worked in television in the 90s, and he wrote it because he wanted to make something that was utterly impossible to put on television. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the Game of Thrones, whatever else is going on, and actually it's a history of the North as well, which is quite fascinating, but apart from anything else, it's the idea that there is a hint, oddly enough, of impossibility. There's a hint of somebody doing something impossible. That he created this wonderfully complicated and ridiculously preposterous narrative, this ridiculous combination of territories and locations and people and tribes that, as Simon says, just becomes a series of discontinuous fragments, with the notion that it could never appear on television. And I find myself sometimes, like Simon, who hated sword and sorcery, and just could not get the idea that this was interfering on the science fiction shelves with the purity of Harlan Ellison and J.G. Ballard and Philip K. Dick. That I found myself seduced by it, but I'm thinking that one of the reasons is there's a little bit of strange hope about the idea that something has twisted its way through a very complicated set of circumstances to still remind us of adventure. And even though it flings itself back into a past, it flings us back into this ridiculous, sometimes slightly sexist and stupidly ignorant representation of the fact the world's become much more infantile, if you like. Childishness, this childishness, I've definitely noticed now, the childishness where people by about 15 or 16 wanted to grow up. Now they can slip through their 20s into their 30s, into their 50s, and still essentially maintain that level of childish engagement. So there's something about it that really infuriated me. So I've decided to explain it to myself, that the idea is that it is a hint of an old-fashioned idea of the impossible. That even though, as Eric Schmidt says, television is dead, but it just doesn't admit it to itself. Here's a hint coming through a weird set of pipes and pipe dreams of a sense of the impossible. I just want to say, Simon, that what this actually is ultimately a question. So I am building up momentum to asking you the first question. So it does have a kind of logic. I also think sometimes that Simon mentioned that sense of maybe this is the future. And it's another case of be careful what you wish for. Because when I was younger, there is to an extent an element of what I was hoping for is kind of what's happened. I think to an extent it's why some of us have sort of managed to make a not quite doddery move into an extraordinarily transformed world that started to happen in the 90s with the internet and those things that really were progressing. A lot of things were definitely stagnant, and creativity had come to a kind of stagnant point in the 90s. And the things that were really progressing were things like computer science and mobile communications and games. These things were still progressing. And to an extent, that's where a form of generational shift came that I was both relieved about and slightly frustrated about. And it's that sense of that's really compromising those elements of when we were growing up, which is a phrase I never thought I'd use, and I apologise for using it, but it's compromised those elements that we actually thought would make the future what initially the internet and these developments sort of suggested. And it's rewritten everything. I was thinking this the other day. I was talking about the BBC moving to Salford, which is in a way a future decision, because the BBC's got to protect itself. And it's got to sort of keep going. The BBC moved to Salford, and superficially this seems to be a traditional statement of alliance with working class tradition, with structures of the 20th century, with moving out of the capital so that the BBC isn't so capital centric. But on the other hand, it's actually a very cunning and I think strategic decision that suggests there are people high up at the BBC who make rather interesting, far-fetched and futuristic conceptual decisions, because actually they've hidden in the shadows. They've not really gone to Salford as such. They've created a kind of piazzaed sort of location somewhere between Dubai and Bilbao that doesn't really exist and is in the shadows. It makes political pretense to defend the idea that the BBC isn't capital centric, but it's actually preparing for something else, this notion that the new cities, in a way, are things like Google and Apple. They're new civic spaces to an extent, the ones that we're more and more inhabiting. The ones that more and more make some of the language we inherit from the 20th century look more and more feeble, because it's just, as Simon says, at every stage of the way in the 20th century, when new things happened, vocabularies developed, language developed, genres were defined. The new thing that's happened isn't quite the same. We haven't got the language and the vocabulary to deal with it, especially those of us who are still haunted by what we did in the 20th century. And what was interesting, I was thinking, this is a future I thought that I wanted, when the building started to look a little bit more science fiction, apparently, glass and steel. On the piazza in Salford, people actually travel from unit to unit on segways in the middle of Salford, which shows you that it's a bubble. It's the BBC actually planning a locationless area, a zoneless area. It doesn't belong anywhere. That's the BBC thinking ahead. So there is future thinking going on, but it's not necessarily what we recognise in terms of what we've prepared for. And I'm thinking, to some extent, I realise what it is that worried me about this new world and this new locationless zone of the Googles and the Apple, these cities, and the people moving into them, endlessly entertained with endless forms of entertainment that are endless. And what I noticed, and this might be me being sentimental and nostalgic again, is that what it started to create is sameness. I find myself being oddly nostalgic, again, in a futuristic way, with things I never thought I would be in terms of 19th century buildings. You know, the formation of the piano in the late 18th century. I'm suddenly making these modern. I'm suddenly trying to make these about the future. Because I'm suddenly panicking that what I hoped for and what I dreamt of, a science fiction future, because that's how we were trained and entertained, and actually I now realise probably more trained, because it was being a Philip K. Dickist, and ultimately paranoid, I feel we were being trained, we were being weaned on popular culture, which will be the way that in this future locational zone of these new cities like Google and Apple, that's fundamentally how we're going to be kept in place and obedient. The ultimate backlash against those of us that had an idealistic spirit in the 60s and 70s, what we believed in would be the thing that changed this, is actually the thing that's going to organise us and control us. And I started to panic that what's actually happening in these zones is everybody's becoming more and more the same. And again, I apologise, it's probably just me being trained as a sort of futurist interested in science fiction who's still trying to cling on to those narratives. On the other hand, that might be part of the cunning deceit that's making me feel like that, so sometimes I apologise about it. So I'm not going to apologise about it. That's the thing that worries me the most. The possibility of everybody coming more and more the same, chasing the same treats, the same pleasures, being herded into the same corners. Whereas once upon a time, the beauty of the world Simon talks about is speed, change, difference. Everyone was different. So if something happened, a drum sound happened, the next thing that had to happen, it had to be different. And the new weaning, the new speed, the new addiction to pleasure seems more about, to me, creating a kind of community of people all the same. And I hesitate about that one because, of course, what that might mean is this is the way things were meant to be, the single intelligence. We're at some weird, peculiar disjunct between when we all thought we were different and all our communities were different and we sounded different and looked different and spoke different, and to the moment we all get herded into one place and our brains fuse. And this, I think, probably is a Brian Aldiss story I read in 1963, so I really have inherited it. But on the other hand, that's something that I think is my concern as an ageing futurist who believes so much in a future that superficially involved what we now know as the internet, that involved this movement through space in an incredibly quick way, this process of time travelling, that we can time travel. Hence our new interest in history, not just because it involves a new level of certainty, whereas suddenly the future doesn't involve certainty.